It wasn't just like, oh, we can create a poster campaign. But it had to be all of these other things that were around it so that people could, A, do it in a way that was authentic to them, and B, feel, some sense of ownership. Yeah, some people came in and did a little bit, came to a block party and, we didn't really see them again. But then there were others who came to that block party and then were like transformed and really got involved. And we had to be okay with all of those things, right, too. A lot of the work was about, at a base level, destigmatizing conversation around domestic violence, getting people involved, not just with the organization, but just getting them involved in their community. So they really understood this as a long-term endeavor. But it's always, I guess, when we talk about, from the ground up, it's really boots on the ground. It's not a hierarchy by any means. It's just who is in that, living that truth every day. And how can we not just involve them, but genuinely help them feel ownership?
Hello, it's Terrance Ruth, and welcome to Illogical by Truth, edited by Airfluence. Today, I have Tania Allen, who is a professor, associate professor of Media Arts, Design, and Technology, the Director of Graduate Programs in Media Arts, Design, and Technology. Most importantly for our conversation today, Tania focused on design as a catalyst for community engagement. Welcome to the show, Tania.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So, very first question, just to start us off. I love the idea of design as a catalyst for community engagement. How did your life story lead you to that idea, that concept? Like, what in the world of design and community engagement sort of landed you in that space?
Sure. Well, I won't give you the super long answer. I'll try not. But I mean, my background is actually not in design. So I have an undergraduate degree in history. So I think my approach to design, first of all, is like very rooted in the humanities and the social sciences. And sort of trying to understand the world and the human experience. But also, I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri. My parents were both teachers and academics. My father, in particular, was a historian of science, but very much a lot of his work, which I grew up hearing a lot about, was about the history of science and eugenics and social science, the social component of science, so science and society, really. And so I think that really rooted me in a belief that your contribution to the world is about social change, is about equity, is or that's what you're striving for anyway, right? So that's kind of the short of it. St. Louis also is a very, very segregated city. I lived in the city, and so I kind of grew up sort of seeing inequality, seeing civil unrest. When Michael Brown happened, that was very, very close to me and close to where I lived in the city. Fairly close, not super close. So all of that, I think, was always kind of swirling around. And even when I started going into design and practicing design, I always wanted to do it with the agenda of engaging with communities, engaging with activists and organizations that are working in communities for community equality and stuff like that. So I think, all of those things kind of influenced my interest in this type of work. Before I moved to Raleigh, I was living in Boston, and I was working with a lot of nonprofits there, intentionally wanting to work with nonprofits. And part of the reason I moved to Raleigh was to get a graduate degree in graphic design. So my background is in branding, strategy work, graphic design, communications, et cetera. And I think part of my motivation to do that was really being confronted with how little I knew about what I was doing. So I was really winging it. And I don't always think that's bad, right?
Yeah.
But I became increasingly aware that while I was winging it, and I think doing some good work with some organizations, I wasn't really inspecting what I was doing to the degree that I wanted to be. And so I kind of used graduate school as a way to take a pause from that. And I still work with many of the organizations that I did, when I from Boston. But anyway, so I think that became, really an important moment for me to think more intentionally about the ways that I wanted to work with community groups. And, now that I'm teaching, to talk to students about how they engage with community groups, individual community members, et cetera.
And what's fascinating? My brother works in the Starbucks that was birthed after the Michael Brown incident.
Oh, interesting.
So they created a Starbucks that is an outward face to the community, and they wanted it to be welcoming to the community. So you can come in, and it doesn't really have the appearance of any other Starbucks.
Right, interesting.
It's supposed to be a place where the community can come in and strategize and organize together, and
That's
so it's a
awesome.
very unique space.
Yeah.
And so it speaks to the creative tension that sits in that area,
For
that
sure.
region. And
Yeah.
so it's helpful to hear that that's a part of your ingredients.
Yeah.
Because he shares how much he is called to do community engagement, even as a barista.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
even as
Yeah.
So our goal on this podcast is always to help listeners understand local government and to empower people to engage locally. That's really our core desire. But we often do not explain why community engagement is important. We normally just assume its significance. Why would you care to leverage design to activate or engage with community?
Community engagement, whether you're an activist or whether you're a resident, I think holds a very similar core principle to design, which is trying to take an existing condition and transform it into a preferred condition.
Really good.
And I think that, so I think I come to design with that and working with communities, whether it's individuals or activists, sort of with that same common goal. I think one of the things that we in design don't do as well, that I think community engagement, again, individuals, but especially in the community activist world, and this isn't universal, but is we don't always interrogate who is this preferred condition for? How do we know this is a preferred condition that we're trying to take the existing one and turn it into? Who are we engaging in this process? Are we thinking about it from all points of view? And with it, community engagement in general, writ large, there's so many different players that are always at the table that you're sort of confronted with those differences of opinion, perspective, agenda, et cetera. And so I think that, a part of that for design too, and design thinking is kind of embracing that, all of those differences and trying to. And trying to make sense of it. So I do think that that's also in the kind of trajectory of design research, design studies. And that's really where my work is rooted now, is sort of in design studies and design research at NC State. That I think that sort of coming together and understanding and trying to embrace that messiness is not always something that we've done in design. But I think we have some strategies for making sense of it that can be really helpful to community organizers and engagement, because I think a lot of times people who are engaging in community work, they're doing it from a very personal, passionate perspective, which is great and is so essential. But I think also sometimes can sort of, I don't want to say cloud necessarily, but can impact the way that you're engaging in the work, right?
And I like the word messiness. I've heard several groups, or at least government entities or institutions, shy away from community because it's not clean and neat.
Right.
And I just appreciate that word messy. And we're not talking about messy in a negative sense. We're just saying there's a linear process. As a PhD student and graduate, there's a way in which I'm trained to think in a linear way.
Yep.
In community, there's no straight line.
Right.
There's a left, right, front, back. There's a pause, continued.
Yes.
There's no. So when I'm thinking of messy, I'm thinking in that way. How are you defining messy? Because I think what you're talking about is the place by which it becomes attractive to people.
Yeah.
Or it becomes something to people.
Or, I think messiness in whatever definition is always going to be a little uncomfortable. And so it's sort of, I think it's a little bit of a paradigm shift in, to your point, what you were just saying, as not seeing messy as negative, but seeing it as an essential part of the process. And that it's never not going to be messy because we're moving through time.
That's right.
Things are always progressing. Things are always changing. And I'll kind of answer that too by saying that what a term that we use, which is not a design, based term, is this idea of wicked problems. I mean, it is sort of a design-based based term. And wicked problems aren't like world hunger, of course, is a wicked problem. It's very complex. It's very messy. But very small problems can also be wicked problems. So some of the definitions of a wicked problem are that it's never going to be fully solved. There's always going to be some other issue that is created by solving part of a wicked problem. And so to kind of go into it with your eyes open to that look, we're addressing, we want to try to understand this problem. We know there's going to be a lot of different perspectives. This is a problem that has been sort of emerging over the last 25, 50 years in various forms, whatever it is. And, we're going to come to the table sort of understanding that there is never going to be any perfect solution to this, but to honestly and authentically try to address part of it in the best way that we can, and then not to walk away and like sort of clean your hands of it and say, okay, I'm done. My job is done. So I think in design, it's also this paradigm shift from sort of coming in, like fixing the problem and leaving, to kind of almost looking, and a colleague of mine used this metaphor, which I love, thinking of our role as designers. And again, I think community activists especially, or community organizations think of it like this too. Think of us as like gardeners, like tending and cultivating.
Really good.
And we have to stay connected.
Really
and we have to, read what we've done in the intervention.
That's good.
And, and know that it's never going to really be done. And so I think that's kind of part of the messiness, that it's an ongoing process,
That's good. It's amazing to me. For us to have our eyes wide open, we have to see these social problems outside the context of political narratives, political campaigns, because they have to present a solution.
Yeah.
And it has to have an end product. That end product may or may not exist in that person's lifetime.
Right.
And they have to be honest about how wicked the problem is so that they're entering to contribute.
Yes.
And not entering to solve, so that the expectation around what local governments can or can't do can also help temper the expectation of community members entering that conversation.
Well, I think that's a really good, and not to go down a political climate hole by any means, but I do think that as citizens, the political, narrative has conditioned us to expect these perfect solutions. And if there's any crack in them, then we can't stand for that. And so that reframing of expectations that you're talking about, whether it's sort of from a design perspective or from a political or a governmental perspective, is so essential. And that's something I think we can all continue to practice because.
And you use the word. You use words like participatory and co-creative process as a means to produce empowered residents and citizens.
Yeah.
most of the everyday listeners out there probably wouldn't use those terms, rarely, if at all. How should we understand those terms? Participatory, co-creation. How would they empower, create ownership in residents themselves?
Well, I mean, I think when I use the word, when I talk about participatory, so I think those are two different things, first of all, a little bit. So, and I'll kind of talk about it from a design perspective, because it might be talked about differently in community engagement and other stuff. But from a design perspective, when we talk about participatory, it's quite literally just asking, potential users, potential community members, whoever's going to be interacting with whatever it is that we're creating, we're asking them to participate in some aspect of the design process, whether that's initial information gathering, whether that's giving feedback directly to a design, so having community meetings, whether that's helping with us with prototyping, whatever that is. And I think that's slightly different than co-creative, because participatory is asking for feedback, but the designer is still kind of in control of what it is that's being created.
Really good.
But co-creative, at least the way that I define it and the way I like to talk about it, is really co-authorship. So it's slightly different in that I think you're partnering with community members from the beginning to understand the problem. You are not the expert. You are looking to community members as content experts and as experts of a lived experience. You do not have any or to the extent that you can't. I mean, we work with clients and we work with municipalities who have agendas, so we can't just go in there and, totally. But we try not to have predefined ideas or solutions, so to be open-minded and to really learn from what the community is telling us and not just get feedback from them or whatever, and endorsements and stuff like that. So I think those are like slightly different. And I really do use the language of like community expertise a lot, because I think that even when we engage, and when I say we, I'm talking generally just about the field of design. But I think when we have engaged, we're using, a lot of times we can kind of fall into a trap where we're using community members as, like a focus group or as a little litmus test, but not really seeing them as experts of their lived experience. And I think reframing it a little bit does help us all be more open.
And I spend a lot of time in community. I'm normally hearing a request for co-authorship. I love how you put that. I'm normally hearing that request, and I normally, and this is just my own experience, so I'm not casting abroad, I normally see institutions struggle to see expertise in community because there's a messy element.
Yeah.
They're used to that nice, clean, somebody that can deliver a particular outcome or message in the drop of a dime. And so that messiness still creeps in the perception of. And so I think framing would help.
Yeah.
I think will help in that way as well.
Well, and I'll just say also that I think that's why it's really important to identify community leaders or people who can sort of be that gateway to the community at large. Because I mean, it's virtually impossible. You can't speak to everybody in the community.
That's right.
But if you establish those partnerships with representatives, let's say, or key players, then you automatically build trust. And you have a strong relationship to so I think that kind of stuff is very important for design in general, especially working with communities.
And now your work emphasized social change, and not just social change, but from the ground up. Why would this be important? Why would anybody ever want to take that journey?
Totally.
Like, what's the benefits of that approach?
Well, I mean, I think in a nutshell, it's coming at it again from a design perspective, but even from a policy, it's the community members that are going to be living with the decisions, right? And I talk a lot with my students and even with my clients when we're sort of engaging in this work, or clients or partners. if you build it, they won't necessarily come. So especially when we're talking about community engagement, there has to be a long-term strategy involved in not just getting people engaged in the first place, but keeping them engaged. And one of the best strategies is to have buy-in because people have contributed to the process and they feel like it's theirs. They own it. Because they're the ones who are going to be living with it. And so I worked for many years with an organization in Boston, in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and I still work with them. They're in a different phase of their work now, but that was really focused on preventing domestic violence. And their whole strategy was, there's these statistics that people who are in violent situations, if they don't have a strong community network around them, it's very difficult for them to get out of those violent situations, right? So a lot of the work was about, at a base level, destigmatizing conversation around domestic violence, getting people involved, not just with the organization, but just getting them involved in their community. So they really understood this as a long-term endeavor of changing community dynamics, getting so many people from the community involved. And so I'll just give you like an anecdote with a campaign that we did where, we put together this task force of like 35 people, all different ages, genders, ethnicities, who were already kind of engaged in the community. And then they were involved in everything from sort of the messaging to the strategy for like, how are we going to, it was a campaign that we were going to do. So how do we get other people involved in this? We had like block parties where people would just come. They became like involved they were the content for like the photographs that we created, not just this task force group, but other members of the community. So they were all kind of becoming a part of the campaign through its creation of it. And that, then they went out and they like hung up the posters and the little thingies that we created and, this, whatever. And then they also, in addition to that, we had these other things that were like these kitchen table conversations that were more about, really getting people to connect with other people. So my point in like telling that story is that it wasn't just like, oh, we can create a poster campaign.
That's right.
But it had to be all of these other things that were around it so that people could, A, do it in a way that was authentic to them. And B, feel, some sense of ownership. Yeah, some people came in and did a little bit, came to a block party and, we didn't really see them again. But then there were others who came to that block party and then were like transformed and really got involved. And we had to be okay with all of those things, right, too. But it's always, I guess, when we talk about, from the ground up, it's really boots on the ground. It's not a hierarchy by any means. It's just who is in that, living that truth every day, and how can we not just involve them, but genuinely help them feel ownership over. And I don't, and I don't know if that was the right strategy. It were, but it's kind of part of a process of like really intentionally wanting people to become a part of all phases of whatever the program is that you're sort of creating.
And what's sort of some of my personal experiences in Ground Up is part of that Ground Up journey is around you, the listener. I was a listener in that moment, listening to pain, historical struggle, not just saying trust, but like, why is there distrust? And they, sharing that pain. And sometimes I might be the end product or the outcome or the output is yelling at me. Or crying with me or whatever that may be. So that's some of that messiness that you have to almost expect.
Right.
When there's generations of disparity and pain and struggle.
Trauma.
And again, this doesn't eliminate their expert role. it just allows you to discover that, that wisdom that's in that space.
Well, and I think that, like, I don't know if this is true in the work that you do, but I think in design, there's this, or there can be this assumption of like, oh, I'm bringing this to you.
Yeah,
you should want me to be involved. Look at how lucky you are that I'm bringing this to you. Instead of, I value your time.
So
I value your voice. I value your experience and your knowledge. And I want to make this an enjoyable experience for you. So, back to this group that we worked at, the neighborhood was, middle, lower income. And everything that we did, or that they did, I shouldn't take credit for this, involved food and fellowship. Because they were like, we want to feed people. Like this will take a burden off of them. It will indicate, because this is true, that we value their time. And, we want this to be an enjoyable experience, that we don't expect them, they don't owe us anything. We owe them, if anything. And, so there was always like that sort of approach to it, which was, we value you.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times we aren't, I'll just speak for design. There's an assumption that by inviting them to the table that we've somehow like given them this great given people this great opportunity. And
no, it's not
we need to do that a little better.
It's not just in design. I've actually heard individuals say, oh, we brought this and they didn't want it. They missed out on this. No. Their input is the goal.
Yeah.
You missed out on an opportunity to really pull from that wisdom.
Yes, that's a really good. That's an interesting way to say that.
But I like that you merge design thinking with community engagement. I don't see that often. Mm-hmm. Usually, I see community engagement as a static moment. A one-time invitation. Yeah. Not a relationship.
Right.
One second, but I like how you merge those two together. What does that look like in local communities? Can you help us see how these two sort of fields or concepts that normally people don't marry together, how do you do that?
I mean, so there's a lot of different ways that I guess I have done that. And I think one of the things... So, it has been through sort of workshops, for example, but where we kind of go through the design thinking process. And I think one of the things that is helpful is it's pretty fun. Like it's fun to do it. It's it's a social activity. Yeah. It's a way for people to get kind of connected to one another. Yeah. It's fun to create things. And especially when you sort of relieve them or us all of the burden of it being perfect, right? I mean, just that sort of activity of both physical, creative, social, whatever, just breaks the ice in a way that I think other things don't. So that's kind of one, very tactical thing. I think also co-producing things together. So when I'm doing a workshop or when I'm engaging, a group or whatever it is, I love to have them have to produce something that we, talk about. Wow. So it's not just them giving feedback, it's them putting ideas and thoughts and images and whatever on paper and then talking through why they did what they did, And I think there's kind of, I hate the word empowering, but I think there is an energizing component to that. And then you've also got an artifact, and you've got kind of evidence of what the thinking is, which can then be used to describe or explain something in the future, can be pointed back to, and as evidence of this is what we heard because you're showing us that this is what you were thinking, and now here's how we've responded to it, or here's what we think our next step is going to be, or or whatever that is. So, I mean, that's kind of the more maybe specific way of answering that question.
What I hear is sort of why we started this whole podcast with Ella Baker. Her philosophy, you already have what you need. You're already prepared to do what you need to do.
Right.
I'm a facilitator, but you are the leader.
Right.
And oftentimes I go in communities where they don't see themselves as creators. They don't see themselves as designers.
Right.
But they live in a history that have produced amazing creators.
Absolutely.
Amazing designers.
Yes.
All local.
Yep.
And it's almost like that history you just need to be reminded of that
Yes.
history. So I like when you was like, that word empower assumes that I'm transferring something to you.
Yeah.
No, you just need to be awoken to what's already
Right.
living in.
And given the space,
Yeah,
given the
that's
space
good.
and the opportunity to contribute it. Because I think that's what, it's like, okay, contribute now, and
that's
it's,
so
here's this
good.
little window.
That's so good.
And you have to
That's so good.
shove your ideas through it
That's so
rather
good.
than being given the space
That's so
to
good.
do it. Yeah.
And I consider that one of my weak areas because that the messiness that produce a rich meal in the end.
Yeah.
For me, I'm an ingredient guy. They said only 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I got to add the rice at this point.
Yeah.
Sometimes you add the rice an hour later.
Yeah. Yes.
Sometimes
Not the worst.
And so for me, I often enter the room and I go, listen, I was trained for many years to where I ended with a PhD, and it has created blind spots for me in creating. And I want to be transparent about that. So I'm going to march in this linear fashion. I need y'all to move me left and right. I need you to move me back. I enter the room stating my weaknesses so that we become a full room and not just leaning on a social perception of expertise.
Right.
But like, listen, you're helping me fill in blind spots.
Yes, absolutely.
And so for me, that was one of my areas.
Yeah.
The rice has to be put in at 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if this might be a little bit of a tangent, but I also think so a lot of times in engaging with community members or again, groups or whoever, I'm sort of walking through the design process. But I think what I'm trying to emphasize is, aside from that sort of fun part, is the iterative nature of design, which I think is very aligned with how community engagement and policy works.
right.
Like it's iterative, and it's not going to be solved right away. And there's going to need to be a constant evaluation, tweaking, changing, or whatever, but also adaptable, flexible, and adaptive thinking too, so that. And this maybe goes more, not the community members so much as the policymakers and, the government officials that they might be who I understand have some very hard agendas that they need to fill. So I think from sort of the community member standpoint, also saying, okay, this is part one of this process, part two of this process. I just have to keep coming back, and so to kind of set expectations, like what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, about this is a process, this is iterative, we got to tweak, we got to try some things out, tweak. And so I do try to kind of bring that into whatever work that I'm doing with the community members as well.
I want to give you two more questions. Some of our listeners do not feel engaged. They don't feel empowered. They don't feel energized or creative or heard. And this is something that's both said outwardly and through body language and silence.
Sure.
So you sort of hear that
Absolutely.
same. What advice would you give to someone seeking to find meaningful community participation that extends beyond just physical involvement in meetings or going to the city council or the county commissioner meeting to a person that's being valued for the generation of ideas, the creation of ideas.
Yeah.
So it's not just attendance, but it's what you produce is important. Like, what advice do you have for someone that's seeking to move from this conversation to plug into more meaningful engagement?
That's a tough question. That's a really tough question. And I'll kind of answer that maybe in two ways. First of all, I don't think it's the job of the community member as much as it's the job of the people in power to attempt to bring people in.
so good,
So
Tania.
that's kind of one thing.
That's good.
And I think what this is just my opinion, but I think what advice I would give to community members or individuals who feel disconnected is to try to start small, and to start with something that is meaningful to them and where they can potentially see change. So whether that's a city block, whether that's something between you and your neighbor, whether that's something within a social circle or network that you already have established. I think those, not putting the burden on yourself to jump from no engagement to like full engagement. It's a process, right? And it's baby steps. And I know, again, for me to feel like I can move forward, I just need to take the first step. And that can often does happen by engaging with people that you're already connected to and, floating an idea with them of something that you might want to change in your immediate community or whatever that is. So that's kind of one thing. I will say that there are really great resources out there also, especially for people who are kind of interested in design thinking. So IDEO, which I'm sure you know about, is a fairly big design firm. They have a whole wing that's open IDEO that has a lot of tools and toolkits and, to kind of use design thinking in different capacities, but community engagement being one of them. So I think that's a really great resource for people who are, again, maybe tapped in, maybe not, but especially if they want to test out some ideas, in an informal network, try to do something in their very immediate community, again, maybe even in their city block or between a couple neighbors, whatever that is. I think that's a really good resource. I also think, if you have access, if you have a bigger project or agenda and you're really interested, but maybe going to the, city government feels a little daunting, reaching out to people who are in universities who are doing projects, or, in colleges of design. I know at NC State, we are always wanting to do extension and engagement work and partner with communities to help them. And so those can be excellent resources to both, help with an idea that you have and how do you frame it and how do you put it, what do you want to do with it, brainstorm, all that kind of stuff. But also that have different, sort of connections to other entities, or institutions or whatever. So those are kind of my two, I think, sort of pieces of advice. if they're advice.
The first one I love because so many community members carry that burden.
Yeah.
That it's their job.
Yeah.
To feed their kids, go to work, and somehow make it to a meeting or make it to it. It's that weight is on them.
Yep.
And I love the pivot of no, the weight is on, because in the research world, it's the researcher.
Right. Yeah, totally.
That has to find representation.
Totally.
It's a job.
Right.
That's a part of your steps.
Right.
But I think local government, that pivot to where it's on them to have to go and make sure that they're hearing the right voice.
Yeah.
Then the second part.
And inviting people, not just it's open, but I would like to invite you to the table. Good. Yeah.
And then we, again, Ella Baker, we brought her one of the archivists from Shaw, and she talked about the room. The hall is still up, but there was renovations, but there was a small little basement classroom.
Yeah.
She started small and changed the whole United States, but it was a small little basement.
Totally.
College students, and she started there.
Yeah,
and most people would have tried to start at the provost.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we feel like in order to make change, we have this assumption it needs to happen at a certain level or certain scale. And that can prevent us from taking that step. So, I mean, that's a perfect example of get a couple people together, have a coffee, talk about what you might want to do, talk about what the issues are, but it doesn't have to be separate from community, socialization or community. And in fact, it shouldn't be, in my opinion. I mean, that's what makes it fun, right?
And some individuals are going to be hearing you and hearing about IDEO for the first time, and they've never been in that space.
Right.
And so they're trying to see where the welcome mat is for that space. And I'm glad that you gave some areas in which they have ownership.
Yeah.
Your own little coffee shop, your own
Yeah.
space. I think that's powerful.
Yeah.
So last question, outside of asking or sharing how people can reach you, is what best practices from across the country can you share? Where are communities doing this well?
Yeah.
Like where are the sort of highlight
Sure.
in the country or in the world that they really have a grip on this thing?
I mean, I'll give maybe a couple different examples that are different scales of things.
Okay.
So here locally, Aaron White, who ran Community Food Lab, I don't know if you're familiar with him and his work, but I think he really did an excellent job of, and he's in the PhD program now, and sort of there's a little bit of a pause on that, but of really thinking about design thinking, community engagement, and public policy and government sort of all intertwined with one another. He worked on projects through Community Food Lab that were very small to more systems-based. And I think in that way, working at these different levels was really powerful in thinking about the very different ways that community engagement and community and change happens. So I think we have a tendency to think about it like we were just talking about at this kind of policy level.
Yes.
But it happens at all these different levels.
right.
And in working in this space, I think what his is a great example of is working in all of these different levels simultaneously and kind of understanding that those are all necessary to larger change. And in Community Food Lab, it's about food and food systems and food access and stuff like that. Another sort of organization that is working in New York City that I think is really interesting is called the Center for Urban Pedagogy. And that actually brings together designers and community. I mean, it could be like nonprofits, it could be like vendors or whatever, to help make policy more legible and understandable to residents or to community members. And I think that's a really interesting initiative because part of what is, I think, a barrier to community engagement is not understanding the policy and the procedures that are potentially in place fighting against, whatever the changes that you want to have happen. And so on a level, and again, they're not trying to like make every policy legible, but they're doing, they're taking one policy around, I don't know, street vending or whatever it is, and sort of understanding how that works. So I think that's a really good one. And then, I mean, I do think for as imperfect as it is, I think what the city council in Minneapolis did around housing and the way that they engaged the community, I mean, exhaustive, 2-year, and just 150 meetings or something like that.
Wow,
It was an ongoing process. And the mayor himself, so the background is, changing their zoning, so there's no single family houses in Minneapolis, to allow for more density, to allow for more housing equity and housing access. Historically, zoning has been a very racist tactic for excluding people of color from home ownership. And that's all still embedded. Now it's, economic, but that's all still there. And so to look at that and to take such a bold move to change their zoning policy, and I'm going to paraphrase this, not exactly, but the mayor said, his historic injustice of this magnitude and economic injustice of this magnitude requires a revolutionary change in the way we're thinking about this thing. So when we speak about the perspectives, you need a city council who is willing to take the risk to do something that revolutionary. We'll see how it all plays out. Obviously, there's a lot of other issues going on, not just in Minneapolis, but all over the country. But I do think that move was really powerful and a real endorsement of of trying to make change, not just around the procedures, but also in some really fundamental policies that, have historically really created generational trauma, have prevented generational wealth building. I mean, when you were talking about going back and going back, that's really taking the long view. And I think that's really inspirational to me.
We had a conversation on a previous episode around this idea of allowing people to fully understand when decisions are being made. So once you decode the language to where it's understandable, there's a timing that happens around zoning, and most people are activated when they start to see physical representation of those decisions.
Yeah.
What would also be helpful is like when these decisions are made. So when you can organize and actually have influence on the decision, on the co-ownership of those decisions. And I just love the resources that you've given out. You have articles that you've written. You've taught at many different workshops and seminars and conventions. How can people reach you in your work? And I was poking around on in your work, and the mapping work that you're doing right now is actually pretty exciting.
Yes, I'm very excited. I am very excited about that. Yes, thank you. So I am on Instagram, although I am not a big social media poster. I consume. I don't post quite so much. I need to kind of flip that, I think, a little bit. But at NC State, I have a lab with a colleague, Sarah Queen, who's an architect, that does use mapping and visualization as a way to kind of illuminate and uncover invisible factors contributing specifically to housing inequity and inequity in the built environment. That's sort of our focus. We are working on a new project, which I'm very excited about, that is looking at housing inequality throughout the U.S., but through this region. Wow. So Raleigh Triangle, the region itself. And what I'm really excited about with that project is how it's sort of evolved. So we started off thinking, well, we really want to hear from the residents, which we do. Yeah. But then as we stepped back, we're like, well, there's a lot of people working in this space, obviously. There's activists, there's politicians, there's developers. Right. And so we really need to start to understand what we were talking about earlier, how each of these perspectives and agenda are contributing to where we are now, but also how we got to where we are now. Good. So we're kind of stepping back and saying, we really need to understand this landscape a little bit better. We need to start to, and it also gives us an opportunity to start to have conversations with and invite them into the process with the people who are our boots on the ground working on this, and to form sort of our own opinion, research, whatever we want to call it, based on those conversations. So I'm excited because it's sort of going to be using and testing a lot of the things that we were talking about today, building a network, hopefully building buy-in, speaking to people at all different sort of levels, whatever. So I'm really excited about that. So that project is going to be encapsulated. We have an NC State website address, which is design.ncsu.edu/collab, CO-LAB. So if people are interested in, if there's anybody out there listening to this podcast who is intimately familiar with this, wants to reach out to be a part of this project network, would love to hear from people. And then I'm just on the NC State website too, so you can shoot me an email, and I'd love to, talk more to anybody about this.
And again, I thank you. Your graphics on that work is amazing.
Oh, thanks.
So again, this has been an episode of Illogical by Truth, edited by Airfluence, and we thank you again for listening and supporting. So I'm Terrance Ruth, and I'll see you on the next episode.